Nearly got away with that recording. So if anyone doesn't want to have their names recorded, please just mute yourself and change your name on the display. But yes, welcome everyone to tonight's webinar and panel discussion. To start off with tonight, I would just like to acknowledge and pay respects to our First Nations peoples, past, present and emerging. Traditional owners have cared for this country upon which we meet and work for over 60,000 years, its lands, oceans, rivers, its trees and wildlife. We endorse the Uluru Statement and acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. And I'm sitting at my home here at Springbrook in the Gold Coast hinterland, which is the traditional lands of the Goomba people of the Ugamba Nation. So tonight, I'm very excited because this is the second webinar and panel discussion for our Sustainable Equine series. Now, this initiative aims to foster engagement, create opportunities for learning, and provide a safe space for open, practical discussions about the real-world challenges and opportunities of embedding environmental sustainability into everyday equine practice. And often this overlaps with good veterinary practice and animal health. So tonight's topic is perfect as an intertwining of these issues. It is called Internal Parasite Management for Horses, Making Routine Responsible. And we're very, very lucky tonight to have an international expert to open up the evening, and then we'll be jumping across to some more Australian experts in the field, where we can discuss many different things. So if anyone does have any questions throughout tonight, can you please pop them into the chat, and I will try and send them over to Catherine as she's going to be chairing the discussion later on. So to open up this evening, we have a short presentation from Associate Professor Nikki Walshe. She's an equine veterinarian, researcher and academic from the University of Limerick, Ireland. And she's going to be providing a wonderful presentation. I'll leave it that broad, Nikki, so that don't cross over there. But yes, looking into the current parasite management landscape in Ireland and beyond. And then we will then open over the discussion to the Australian setting. We have the wonderful Catherine Chicken, who's going to be chairing this evening, making sure that we don't go too astray. And then I would like to introduce the panel and say a big thank you for joining us. We have Professor Chris Hughes from Charles Sturt University, Dr. Anne Beasley from the University of Queensland. We have Dr. Wendy Perriam, who is a resident veterinarian for Arrowfield Stud. And then we have Dr. Tia Holyoake from International Animal Health. So I'm going to hand over to you, Catherine, to give us a bit of an overview for the rest of the evening.
Do it every time. Thank you very much. It's great to see everybody. This clearly is a topic that is of importance to everybody in equine practice and the equine industry. We've had probably record registrations for this webinar, which just shows the level of interest that there is out there in managing internal parasites sustainably. And I would really just want to highlight that the aim of this evening is to show everybody the importance of making changes to our management practices such that we have Anthelmintic use available to us into the future, and making sure that everybody understands that the responsibility is a shared one, that the sustainability for us is as important for sustainability into the future and for future generations to come. So whatever drives you, whatever your motivations are in sustainability, whether that be environmental, economic or social, all of those drivers are important, and they're all going to be more and more important to us all as we go forward in an ever-changing world. So I would just like to open up the presentation initially to Nikki Walshe, who's going to give us a bit of an overview of the internal parasite landscape in Ireland and the issues with Anthelmintic resistance in her country and around Europe, I'm sure as well, having just read a LinkedIn article today. So, Nikki, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate having you here.
Thanks for having me. And you're both so kind. I don't know if I'd call myself an international expert, but I do love worms, so that's probably a good start. And yeah, just to give a background, I am an equine clinician, and I actually worked in Australia and New Zealand for 4 or 5 years. I worked up in all the usual places, so Matamata, Scone, Melbourne Racecourse, etc. So I have a good feel for it. And interestingly enough, I came home from Australia not really having considered worms too much, and came home to Ireland, and there was horses who were dying of worms, and I was like, "What is this?" And that is how I got interested in parasites preliminary, I suppose, back nearly 10 years ago now. And so over the last maybe 7 or 8 years, my main focus is working with vets and with owners, just like you said, Catherine, around the whole point of management change. And that's kind of going to be the main crux of what I'm going to talk about today, with anthelmintic resistance in the background. And therefore, we no longer can lean on that crutch of anthelmintic use that was so beautiful for us for the last maybe 5 decades, and we now need to look at things a little bit differently. So just to start us off, as we all love to do, this is a map, I suppose, of the main areas that we have research in. So it's not even really a good indication of resistance and its prevalence. It's more an indication of the research of resistance and the prevalence within that research. But as you can see, it is very much a global issue. And if you see where the clusters of this research are, it's where our horse community pretty much resides. But we have to remember we have a very transient horse community, particularly within our thoroughbred populations, both across Europe, but also internationally across America, which you'll see in a paper I'll put forward in a minute, and also of course, shuttling horses to and fro from Australia and New Zealand all the way back up to Ireland, England, and further afield. And we have to remember with that comes resistance. So we are in a weird way connected through these parasites. And therefore, I suppose it's lovely to be invited to these kind of events where we can see it as a more global problem. And so when we look across our the research we have done, as you can see, smack bang in the middle there, benzimidazole, so our panicure, our 5-day panicure, that particularly in Ireland anyway, is still seen as that silver bullet, the treatment of the year for the horses. Every single study that has been done since in the last 26 years has shown 100% resistance. So, and even anecdotally, because I do a lot of parasitology consultancy where I go onto farms and work with vets and owners, every farm I have gone on, I have found resistance to the point where often fecal egg counts will go up after treatment. But worryingly, we also are starting to see macrocyclic lactone resistance. And I made this slide probably a year and a half ago and have not updated it because I'm useless. But we have since had further indications of macrocyclic lactone resistance, particularly in England and France, but only because that's where they're looking. I certainly have found it on farm on a regular occurrence where I'm working also. So the big papers that came out from Ireland, there was my good friend Martin Nielsen, who caused us great reputational damage, but it was a very important paper at the same time, that there was importation of macrocyclic lactone resistance into the US from Ireland, is what that title misses. And these were honestly, this is one of the top studs in the country, and it's one of the top studs in Kentucky. And that's why this was such a big paper, because no longer was parasites a problem of the dirty farms or the unkept horses. This was now a problem of very high caliber, intense systems, right? And as you can see, the figures in this are frightening. With the first dose of ivermectin, these were 3 groups of Irish yearlings that were stocked together in Kentucky. And in group 5 there, you're talking about 33.8% fecal egg reduction with ivermectin use. And you have to remember, like, these yearlings are the sentinel of farms, right? So they're born on the farm. They only get parasites from that farm. So they are the huge indicator of what's going on your farm specifically, okay? And so for the first round of ivermectins to only hit 33.8% was hugely worrying. And I suppose the other thing that I would have talked to Dr. Nielsen about was that once you have resistance with ivermectin, you often will get resistance with moxidectin because they do work similarly, right? The whole point of moxidectin is it's absorbed into the fat and released over time, and therefore it works more effectively as a result. But the mechanism of working is pretty much the same. So thinking that we're preserving our moxidectin and using our ivermectin, we have to keep that in mind. Then specifically on Irish farms, there was a lovely paper done by one of my colleagues, Najwa, and again, benzimidazole was hugely resistant, but it's interestingly, two farms that were just above the cusp. But again, really worrisome. We had ivermectin and moxidectin resistance recognized on some of our farms as well. So again, this is moving us towards recognizing that within the strong dog population within Ireland, cytostomans particularly, we now have what we're looking at is multi-drug resistance. And I have found at least 2 farms where I have multi-drug resistance to cytostoman, and I literally have no wormer that is fully effective. We also, interestingly, had the introduction of what we call POM, so prescription-only medicines. That came in December 2025. And I suppose, you know, oftentimes, particularly as us vets, we're very hierarchical, right? And we're very solutions-oriented. So we're like, look, we'll bring in a law and everyone will do what we're told, right? But needless to say, like with most laws, this hasn't affected behavioral change because, of course, people have found the loopholes, right? And for instance, within this law, it's really interesting. There was a huge, I suppose, political debate over the fact that they brought in, you must have a proper assessment. But the specification of that assessment was not given. And so we pushed for an on-farm assessment. We wanted those exact words, but proper assessment is what came in. And so what is happening now is that there's vets who are employed by co-ops, so cooperatives who sell drugs, etc., who then just ask 5 questions. They get some form of information, and that is considered a proper assessment. So we've now moved from having the opportunity to have like a legislative gateway for our vets to be in, like, intimately involved with on-farm assessment to moving to a vet who is probably telediagnostics really providing prescriptions and I suppose that how would you say that tension then between that vet and the vet who's actually going out to those farms when things go wrong. So again, we have to be so careful about the solutions we create without recognizing the barriers that we're trying to face. And that means that we have to turn our focus to the biological and behavioral elements that contribute to resistance, right? And when we talk about biological, the thing that I suppose struck me, maybe this is a light bulb, I've had many light bulb moments because there's so much to learn, right? But one of the light bulb moments for me was when someone was like, it's not when you choose the wrong wormer or the wrong time. It is every time you give a wormer, you choose resistance. Every time. So the thing is that, you know, when we are using them, we have to use them strategically because what we're trying to fight is the risk of parasite disease. But even when you do that, you're still choosing resistance, right? And why I want you to keep that in your mind is that what we are finding here, because we are in a temperate climate, right? Today is the 3rd of June. We're meant to be in our summer. It's raining and it's 14 degrees, right? And it means that we have year-round transmission, which gives us beautiful opportunity for our parasites to have this genetic adaptability where they can take on resistance and propagate it like fire, right? So when we're choosing every time for resistance, we're building up that resistance piece on the pasture. Perfect. Right. We've got that in our head. But what's happening us now is we have the same farms using the same deworming protocols with very different outcomes. So instead of me getting the calls where they're like, oh, Nikki, we wanted a new deworming program, which is my least favorite request ever. I now get calls, Nikki, we have horses dying. Right. This is the big change that we are seeing. And Sarah Dwyer is on this call as well. And she can speak to that as well. And most vets that I'm talking to now are facing something that they haven't faced before. Okay. And so a really nice example is a paper I did with Sarah, who Sarah was the primary vet and I was, I suppose, the backup, the backup academic. But, you know, we saw a really high level group of yearlings. One of these sold for 100,000 at the 2-year-old sales, and they succumbed to what we call an acute larval cytostominosis, so the acute form of the reemergence of cytostomin from the gut walls in an outbreak scenario. Okay, we had 9 horses affected, 3 hospitalized, 6 were presented with very severe disease. And interestingly, which is very common in these, they represented 2 to 4 weeks later with that second wave of emergence. So again, this is a farm that was doing the same thing, the same protocols, the same movement of horses that they've done for years, but now they met that tipping point, right? And the thing which you guys know so well, but we, I suppose, don't know as well, and particularly because of, you know, the experience you guys would have with your sheep farmers, etc., and struggling with resistance. But resistance does not reverse, right? So the horse parasite population, we have to remember that we have years of those larvae within the gut walls, right? And like clinically normal horses can have up to 1-2 million larvae in their gut walls, right? So if we have the usual wormers that we're using that are getting less and less efficacious, we're only taking 10-20% of that, right? Every time we worm, if even. And of course, reinfestation happens so quickly. So the reservoir within horse is very high, but also the reservoir on the pasture is really high. And the thing is that like there's some beautiful old school studies that sometimes get forgotten, but they really are so fundamental. And like there was a lovely study by the gods of parasitology in Lyons and Tolliver, where they went and looked at a population, and they went back 20 years later, having not used Panicure, where they had found Panicure resistance, and Panicure resistance was still present. Because when we choose for a resistant gene, we actually choose for the worms that are most viable, like the super worms, if you will. Okay. So what I'm asking today, or what I ask of most of these talks that I do, is the paradigm shift. Okay, so this is one of my favorite pictures of my PhD. So it is the gut lining of a horse who actually didn't die of acute larval cell pneumonitis, where the larvae are still within the mucosa. And as you can see, they're covering the entire mucosa. And these are the ones we can see. Don't forget our hypobiotic EL3s are not visible in this. And we're shooting up some lovely light through the mucosa, and we're getting that transillumination, right? But what I'm asking of you today is that you move away from looking at this as a horse problem, right? Because actually it's a pasture problem. So these little guys, this is a lovely nature image. It's actually homunculus, but strongulls are strongulls when it comes to visuals. They are the problem. If we don't deal with them on the pasture, it doesn't matter what we do for them in the horse, right? And so I suppose what we're trying to move towards instead is that parasites are a pasture problem that manifests as horse disease, right? And so when we're going onto farms, the first questions should be, what are you doing with your pasture? Not what's your worming protocol? What are you doing with your pasture, right? And so to investigate this, the thing that we've realized is that it's not actually an information problem. Most people know that there's anthelmintic resistance. Most people know that parasites can cause disease. The problem we're facing is a behavioral problem, right? So if you sit down and talk to people, they tell you it's a problem, but then they tell you all the reasons why they can't deal with it. Right. And so what we did is we've created guidelines and all that crack as well. I didn't want to go into that because it's not about our guidelines today. It's about you guys. But what we did do behind all of that is we went and spoke to the people, as they say. And so we went and spoke to the owners, and we said, like, what's getting in the way? Like, you know, you seem to understand this. These are the kind of things we're thinking of doing. Like, what's the issues? And of course, they're all the issues that we know ourselves, right? You know, so they do talk about lack of knowledge from the point of view of consistency, right? So they get told one thing by one vet, one thing by another. Oh, you just give ivermectin twice a year. Oh, sure, just give Equine 3 times a year, or whatever. There's no consistency there. There's a lack of trust because of that conflict, okay? And particularly fecal egg counts. Fecal egg counts have not been treated the way they should be, and so many people have lost faith in that. And then the logistical challenges. And we, like anyone who has horses knows this, you know, and anyone who's worked on proper thoroughbred farms, etc., certainly know this. If you don't have the people, you can't do the work, you know. And then lack of access. So they have a big piece around financial constraints, and lack of tailored services, etc. But the driver that we see again and again is tradition. This is what we've always done. We have confidence in it. And it's not till, like that farm we showed you earlier, where you break out of that because your tradition ends up in disease, is when you get the buy-in. And we need to try and get that buy-in a step ahead. And so we also asked them, of course, what would help, right? So they talked about education again, practical tools, centralized information. And I think this should be a global effort. Like, I think we need to start, like, there's guidelines, and now in Australia there's the canter guidelines. In England there's there's guidelines being created across multiple um, countries in Europe. And we're kind of all saying different things, and we certainly can, because we all have different climates. But there should be centralized core beliefs amongst the kind of equine parasite community, in my opinion. Trust and confidence will come with that. And then easy implementation, giving people like habit stacking. So like a lot of the stud farms I work with, for instance, particularly if I want to look at my mares, and I'm sure we'll get more on this later. But you know, putting it with the 42-day scan, putting it with the farriers when the for the yearlings coming in, things like that. And then of course subsidies, remote consults, things like that. So people always want financial support in these things, and we are starting to get some of that now in Ireland, thankfully. And then we also, of course, went back and talked to the vets. And one of the things that really pushed in regards to the vet was this professional alignment. And we actually went on to create, micro credentials within the university environment for vets. We now also have a department-backed training for vets in this. So we are starting to get a more uniform industry approach, which is really, really helpful. The other thing that I'm sure the vets on the call will relate to is that a lot of time people just call vets when things have gone wrong and don't actually value the vet's opinion before that. So the thing that they talk about all the time is that, like, the lack of recognition of, their expertise in parasitology at any other time. So scan the mare and someone goes, oh, I have a foal there, what'll I worm it with? Right. And it's always what'll I worm it with. I've given these talks. I can give a 2-hour talk and someone will still ask me what they should worm their mare with. Right. So we are fighting that entrenched dogma that when you think of worms, you should automatically think of what wormer is effective, right? Rather than where did they come from. And so, again, they talked about education, and that's where we created the CPD, talked about proactive practice, which is why the training program has come in from the Department of Agriculture, and then economic models, which again has come in from the Department of Agriculture. So we are making some inroads, but we went and talked to the people first to see what inroads might help them. And then when we bring it all together, what we're actually moving towards is this connection piece, this engagement piece, where it's collaborative and not hierarchical. So what we're trying to say is that there's a shared responsibility. And I when I was looking through your guidelines, I could see that. And there was a whole piece on how to engage with your owner, how to engage with the farmer to really get them on board with some of these changes, because these changes are so hard and the output is not visible most of the time. And so again, it's that better communication piece, but also looking at results together. And then, of course, recognition of this work is the big piece for vets, because there's no point in spending 2 hours out there when you could have been doing, 20 sets of yearling x-rays and making a fortune. So there's so much more, needless to say, I could talk about, which I'm not going to, but just to end on 2 points. So parasites are a pasture problem, not a horse problem. And when we think about how we're going to approach this, it's not lack of information. It's finding a way to affect behavioral change that will make the difference. And that's me. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Nikki. That's a beautiful overview of the problems we all share, basically. I don't think it's, things are any different here. And it's just great. I think that comment around, every time you select to treat with an anthelmintic, you're selecting resistance. And we're seeing it across antimicrobial resistance, and we're seeing it across anthelmintic resistance. And so we've got issues in all sorts of areas in which we treat horses and other animals and humans, and it's a One Health issue. So the whole issue is that we have to look at this holistically, and we have to be doing things as a partnership and in cooperation with owners and farmers and collaboratively. So I would just like to now pass on to particularly Anne and Chris, who were intricately involved in the development of the Australian guidelines at the end of 2024, Anne, wasn't it? So I think, we just do want to get a local lens on what things are looking like here, and just alert people to the resources that are available to them and how they can be utilised in basically affecting behavioural change, which is what we're all after. We've known these things for a very long time. So, Anne, I'd just like to pass over to you to give a bit of an overview of some of the other work that had been done prior to the AgriFutures study in the thoroughbred sector, and how long, we saw from Nikki just how long the resistance has been building in over 20 years and lots of studies. And I know that the situation is not that different here. So I'm going to hand over to you, and Chris, you can do a tic-tac and talk about the guidelines, how they were developed, where you can get hold of them. Off you go.
All right, thanks, Catherine, and fantastic talk, Nikki. I thought not enjoying your problems, but just completely relating to everything you said in there. And I like the way you framed that, actually, about it being a pasture problem. And I think if we all had $1 for every time we get asked the question when to treat and what to treat with,
Yes.
there's just no simple answer to that. So I guess just as a bit of a background to how these Australian guidelines came to be, they sort of are the culmination of about maybe 4 or 5 years of work that was done across Australia, led by the University of Melbourne. Shout out to Abdul. I think he's in the audience tonight, and a wonderful PhD student, Gaz, who did all of the legwork, and funded by AgriFutures, looking at, I guess, where resistance stands in our country, how the industry is actually managing worms on the ground, so through surveys of horse owners and managers and also vets, to try and find what the gaps are. And I guess in a nutshell, what we found pretty consistently was that resistance is widespread. I guess we weren't surprised by that, but the extent was a little shocking. And also that I guess, we still are pretty much reliant on this sort of calendar-based deworming approach that sort of has driven us partly to this problem in the first place. So the guidelines were really just, I guess, our attempt to translate all of that local evidence into some sort of practical, actionable recommendations that sort of fit Australian conditions, because I guess traditionally we tend to just borrow from other guidelines that were written in other parts of the world, in Europe or America, for example. And we know that, our climate here is so diverse. So, I mean, that being said, that they're not meant to be, I guess, a rigid prescription because of that diversity. And there's just so much judgment and nuance that is required to make sense of these within the context of every single property. So I guess that's the background to how our Australian guidelines came to be. Chris, did you want to add anything to that, or any of the key findings that jumped out to you?
Oh, that was a really good summary, and absolutely a shout out to Abdul, who is the driver behind this project, but also I think Eddie Wilkes is lurking there in the audience, and I think that just it's that the broad cricket team authorship of the guidelines and other publications that came out of this project sort of really reflect that there are a multitude of us working in this discipline, sharing concerns and realization that we need to get Australian-centric information to best drive change. And you touched on it, and Nikki absolutely captured that it's a global issue. And I think the challenges that we're finding are reflective of the challenges elsewhere in the world. I think Catherine was keen for us to sort of mention that we've collectively as a group had also been working on this prior to getting the band together, and I think this is, whilst these guidelines and the research that was substantial and certainly Gazanfa Abbas did a fantastic amount of work on this. It's not just a thoroughbred problem. This obviously funded through AgriFutures, and so this research was done through a thoroughbred lens. But a lot of us have been working in other areas with other breeds, and recognise that resistance is a horse population level problem, and parasites don't pick favourites. And so, we see it in standardbreds, we see it in ponies, we see it in any horse breed. Concerningly, you mentioned on this, we've documented resistance in a wide setting in Australia in both ascarids but also small strongyles, and we're seeing resistance across the three major nematicide drugs that we've got at our disposal. So if that doesn't warrant concern, I don't know what does.
And that includes the combinations too, Chris, which we're lucky enough to have access to here in Australia. But yeah, Gaz's work sort of captured that as well. So the severity and the extent is quite extreme.
Excellent. Go, Chris.
No, sorry. No, look, I absolutely couldn't agree more. And whilst Edwina Wilkes and I did some work on combination anthelmintics during and after her doctorate, and yes, they can be very useful drugs or combinations, and they're an additional dimension that we're fortunate enough to have in Australia. I don't believe they're available in the United Kingdom, Ireland. I'm not sure, Nikki. No. So yes, there are advantages there, and we use them, but we should use them with care and due consideration as to whether they're going to be effective. And as you said, we're starting to find resistance there as well.
Excellent. Thank you both for a great summary of the guidelines, how we got there, and and that the issue is across all horse populations globally, basically. So we're, as you say, resistance doesn't pick favourites, Chris, and we're all in this together, and we're, living it together. So I think now, Nikki, having pointed out that parasites are a pasture problem, I think it'd be lovely now just to pass over to Tia Holyoake from International Animal Health, who is representing on the panel, to give a bit of an overview of some of the biological components of a targeted management plan in looking at interrupting the life cycle of these parasites on the pasture. Tia, if you wouldn't mind just sharing your screen when you're ready, and you can give us a little bit of an overview of just what biowormer is, how it's been developed, and where it fits in a targeted management plan. It's coming.
Can you all see me?
It's coming, I think.
Oh no. Let me try this again. Hang on a minute.
It's always when you've done the prior practice that you keep going away, working away, and we'll have a bit of a chat. Wendy, is there anything you'd like to bring up at this point in time on the back of what's been said already? Just from a very practical standpoint, just pop yourself off mute and don't do what I do.
Funny. Thanks, Catherine. Well, it depends on which direction you want me to head, but I certainly would like to comment on the practicalities of the new system, if you want to call it that. One of the things I think is blatantly obvious is we historically had it really easy because we didn't have to use our brain particularly well. We could just rely on the calendar based on that old advice, now outdated advice of worming every 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever it was. And that was often aligned with a management technique such as the farrier. So as I said, we didn't really need to use a lot of brain power. And the current system, I think, requires much, much more mental gymnastics, which shouldn't put us off at all. It just means we're traveling in a slightly different lane. And the mental gymnastics are not insurmountable. It just takes a little bit more flexibility, a whole lot more understanding of the system. And I can see that Tia is now pulling faces. Did you?
Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Shall I swap back out, Catherine?
That's all good. Yes, have we got screen up? And even if we don't, Tia, we'll flick to you and you can give us a bit of an overview of biowormer, either verbally or visually, whichever way it comes.
I'll give you an overview, and then I've got a wee video that hopefully I'll be able to share with you guys just to show.
I love this video.
It's one of my favorites.
It's a cool
Thanks,
video.
Catherine. So yes, my name's Tia. I've been working with international animal health for 4 months now. And when I first learned about biowormer, I was fascinated. It's, a biological control for nematodes, which is just, I think, fascinating. So today I hope to spark some curiosity for you all for the product biowormer, which I think has some really exciting potential, especially for, in this sort of field with sustainability and pasture management. So what is it? What's biowormer? It's a product that can be added to feed, and it contains the spores of Darlingtonia flagrans. Now, it does sound like a name straight out of the Chamber of Secrets, but it is a fungi. It's a native fungi to Australia, and it's naturally occurring in the environment. But more importantly, it is a natural predator for nematode larvae. So how it actually works, so you feed these spores, you feed biowormer, the spores pass through the gut. They're incredibly resilient and resistant to digestion. So they're inert passing through the gut, and they come out in that nice, warm, dark manure patch full of larvae, full of food. And then from there, I will show you what it does if I can do this for you guys. Let me just share my screen. I'm just going to share the... So you should be able to see my screen now. Can you see it? Can you all see my screen? Yes? Lovely.
Yeah, we can see that.
So this is a video. Now, we don't have copyrights, but it's just to give you an idea of it all, and I'm sure you will all recognize the voiceover as well.
In cooler, drier woodlands, they have great difficulty in living out in the open. Instead, they hide in the ground or within the tissues of the bodies they feast on. The fungus has no stem, no root, no leaves. For most of the time, it's nothing more than a tangled tissue of branching threads. These produce digestive acids, absorb the resulting soup, and then use it to construct more tissue. But cellulose is very low in nitrogen. To get that, some fungi trap living animals. The microscopic threads develop tiny lassos. These give off a chemical that attracts microscopic worms, nematodes. One of them nuzzles into the ring, and the fungus suddenly draws its lasso tight. The worms are killed, and the fungus has its nitrogen. All this
I think we may have come sort of to the end of it. If which is it's lovely to hear that voiceover.
Can you all see me now?
Yeah.
We have you.
Back to you.
Yes, we've got you. And
Yes.
I just love that video because it's just so visual. And for a visual learner, just every time I think about it, I think about a strangling larvae, which is amazing.
It's beautiful.
And just I guess what's interesting is that it's not just utilised in horses. It's a product that has been utilised in other species, to my knowledge, and certainly used probably more extensively in other species where resistance has probably preceded the significance of resistance in the that we know of in equine populations. So, Tia, just give a little bit of an overview of, that where it has been used, and whether you have got any examples of it being used in an equine setting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess what would it look like in a parasite management plan in an equine setting? Well, for example, if you take a farm, where you've got your yearlings, your weanlings, your broodmares, etc. They're usually a high stocking rate. They're usually, not spelling pasture as they should be, and they usually don't use, rotational grazing for the most part. So, and if you're lucky enough, some of them do quite frequent fecal egg counts, to monitor their parasite burden in the pasture. So introducing biowormer in this sort of setting, you can see some measurable differences, and especially in the amounts of individuals that would move from your high to moderate shedders into your low shedders, which ultimately, then you can start using that strategic treatment of anthelmintics and ultimately reducing the amount of anthelmintics and reliance on anthelmintics. So particularly in, I think it would be useful, particularly in, I think, Nikki, you touched on it, in clients with known resistance, or the sort of at the inroads. They're doing all the things in the toolbox correctly. They've tried everything, and they're treating strategically, and then 6 weeks later you're starting to see those fecal egg counts come back up again. Bioworm is quite a nice thing to have in your back pocket to recommend to clients, especially that are just struggling. And for example, the farms who just, it's not practical for them to be using those other tools in the toolbox.
Do we have it being utilised extensively in an Australian setting at this point in time?
It's definitely growing. We are getting lots of feedback from, especially farms, your yearling and your trainers and your sales prep farms, who are using it quite extensively. And you do see that reduction in anthelmintic use and reliance on it as well. But most of these farms are frequently fecal egg counting, so they're able to display a measurable difference once they've started biowormer. Okay. It's also important to note, especially in this discussion, that it's certified organic, it's non-GMO, it's chemical free, and it's residue free. In all ages.
For this discussion, which is around sustainability, not just sustainability of anthelmintic efficacy, but sustainability across the whole landscape.
Yeah, absolutely.
The environment of the animal being so important as well.
Yeah, and on that, it doesn't have any effect on your non-target species either. And it can be used in all ages, all stages. It's a very versatile product.
Thank you very much for that wonderful summary. If there are any questions in the chat, Caitlin, are you able to just monitor those as we go along? Just to check that there's nothing popping up.
I am. Nothing's popped up yet. Everyone's being shy. That's
okay.
Being shy.
That's all fine. And I would just like to also, if we can pop the screen, the other slide up of the resources that have come out of the guidelines, which I should have done just before Tia spoke, but that's all fine. So these are the resources that have come out of the guidelines being developed, and the necessity to basically have some resources available both for farms and for veterinarians to be able to utilise those guidelines effectively, but in a kind of pocket guide which is easy to access and easy to use, in language that is hopefully appropriate for those different settings. And these are available on the AgriFutures website through the Thoroughbred Horses program. There'll be a few hard copies that we'll have at Bain-Fallon to make sure everyone's seen them. But basically they are accessible digitally now. There's a QR code which will take you to the veterinarian's guide, and just if you scroll down at that point, there's also the link to the industry guide. So hopefully out of those resources, we will get a whole lot more knowledge across the industry and across different sectors. This is not just specific to thoroughbreds. These guidelines are made for the thoroughbred industry because the funding was from the thoroughbred industry for the study. So just because of that does not mean that they're not applicable in other horse populations. They certainly are. I don't think that many of the problems will be particularly unique, and everywhere you've got a population of horses, you're going to be having resistance issues at this stage of the game. So that they're just there for you all to be able to take a click of the slide. And I'd just now like to ask Wendy Perriam to just give us a bit of an overview of what it looks like trying to enact management change in this space. I know that Wendy's had frontline experience and just what that's like and what the changes have meant and how you've gone about getting it done.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, if I just give a quick bit of context, I do work on a farm that has a reasonably closed herd. And I know that's not necessarily representative of a lot of farms, but we don't have a huge influx temporarily of mares coming on and off the farm. We have a large resident population. So I'm a little bit spoilt in the systems that I can set up and how well they are adhered to by the farm. And basically, we as resident veterinarians champion this whole cause, and we are overseeing every year there's slight variations in our approach depending on new information, variances in the climate of any given year, etc. So, one thing I do want to say is that we have touched a little bit on climate variation, but it is really important to consider the different climate you have in your area. But further to that, and I think this is something we should use a whole lot more, particularly from an Australian standpoint, perhaps not so much, Nikki, in the Northern Hemisphere or in Ireland or England, but particularly in Australia, we need to be very well aware of, Dorothy McKellar got it right 120 years ago. We are a land of drought and flooding rains. And so we need to benefit the system when we do have those nice, hot, dry periods. And so when we talk about practical implications of running the system that we currently run at the farm, we do keep a really broad mind about what we do year on year. So there's no prescription of what we do as far as considering treatments on a regular basis. It's a rolling feast, and I think we need to be a little bit flexible with each season, and obviously, as I said, very much keeping in mind your climate. So we live in a slightly subtropical, a little bit temperate, depending on what Mother Nature has dealt us in any given year. And very uncharacteristically, we had quite a dry summer. That's not what we typically have. And so we use that to good effect. What I want to say, though, is that when I first came over into New South Wales, the first thing that we were implementing or looking at was fecal egg counts in our quarantine mares. And so this was back 2010, and as is commonly reported around the world, we immediately determined that the BZs were not effective against our strongyle. So we started this process quite some time ago, and I have to say that over the course of the last 15, 16 years, we have modified that system a little. But the key thing I think we need to consider is, if I just talk about the mature horse, and I'll talk about the mare, apologies to the boys in the room, but we'll talk about the mare as an example. We're talking about, obviously, small strongyles being our major concern, and so that's what I'm going to talk to. That's not discounting that there are other concerns, of course, and the large strongyle, Strongylis vulgaris, is probably the one we need to be really aware of. But let's go just to talk about the small strongyles. What we'll do with our population is we'll ascertain high or low shedders through multiple fecal egg counts in that first year. So when I say multiple, we will do a minimum, preferably of 3. We do always do a quarantine-based fecal egg count, but to me that is more about the immediate quarantine period and not about her egg shedding status, because we don't know what she was given just before she came to our place. We have sometimes that information as to when they were dewormed and with what active, but ultimately that fecal egg count in quarantine is designed for us to make a decision on what we do next with that mare. So we'll just park that for a minute. So within that first year, each mare on the farm will get her fecal egg count assayed to determine if she's a high or low shedder. Now, immediately you're getting that result, you're implementing change straight away, because 80% of them are going to have low egg counts. So almost immediately you are reducing your deworming plan as you go. And so then we go through the various seasons, and I do usually just do 3, and some farms, depending on your climate, might want to do 4. That's related to where your strongolds are at their highest transmissions. But we will do minimally 3, ascertain their egg shedding status. And then in the subsequent years, we don't need to continue at a regular basis doing fecal egg counts on those low shedding mares, because they manage to stay within that category across the year, across their life, I should say. When we talk about their life, I'm not talking about the aged mare, but through, say, to 15, 16. So we don't have to continue with the fecal egg count through those periods, but we do fecal egg counts on the high shedding mares on a regular basis, because they do the heavy lifting for us as far as ascertaining if our actives are still working. So the high shedding mare, of which we have roughly the 20% of those mares, will get a fecal egg count. We then look at a percentage of those mares to give a dewormer to, and then assess at the 14-day mark. If I can just pause for a minute, I think there's a really, really good website that we should be using if we're looking at herd health. It's fecrt.com. That has a really nice system that you can plug in your mare numbers, you can plug in the technique that you're using for your fecal egg count. What you specifically need to know there is your multiplication factor. Depending on, so if it's a McMaster's, it's invariably a 50 times, but you know, there is some variability in that. And you put in your susceptible population, your anticipated fecal egg count in the high shedders, and then it will tell you how many mares you should be testing to give yourself good, robust science on whether or not that is going to give you confidence intervals to say whether or not you've got reduced efficacy of your drug. So just as a little aside, I think that website's great. You can just drag and drop your Excel spreadsheet if that's what you've got, which is potentially
I've added that website to the chat too, so if anyone wants to see it there, it's added to the chat with a link.
Thank you. And that's come off the WAAVP publication from a couple of years ago, which stands for World Association of Advanced Veterinary Parasitology, and they've just given us a whole lot more robust science about how many mares we should be looking at to determine whether we've got emerging resistance or not within our herd. And that's been a really useful tool for me. So now I know that of that 20% of high shedders, how many of those do I need to be testing on a fecal egg count reduction test to be confident that my actives are still working at the level that you set it at. Yeah, so that's probably one of my take homes. I think is really important. And then as far as the young population goes, they are slightly more challenging, and I think we haven't really touched a lot on the ascarids at this point. But the ascarids, which we haven't really pushed, but I think if there's take-home messages, just are not routinely responding to any of our MLs. And I still hear, unfortunately, talking with colleagues and other farm-based managers, that the ML is still being used in that young horse for ascarid control. And I think if there's anything I want to really make a point of, that's just something we shouldn't be doing, because it's it's obviously not very effective across a multitude of ascarid populations. And then the corollary, as I said before, was that the BZs are really not effective. And Nikki very eloquently described the BZs are not effective against strongolds as a sweeping statement either. So there's a lot more to think about as far as managing your population. One of the other things that I think we need to consider is how can we do the fecal egg count where it's not reliant on staff standing out in the paddock waiting for a horse to poop. Very, very tedious. As a veterinarian, we say we need a manure sample off that horse and walk away thinking, okay, we've got the job halfway done. The staff out there are going to waste an inordinate amount of time waiting for that horse to pass manure. And so we need to use the management things that we are actually involved with as veterinarians to our advantage. So, for example, for us, all of preg testing occurs very conveniently the end of April, early May, which is ideal because autumn is a really high shedding period for us. And obviously there's some conversation we could have there around tapeworm. It's a good time to be looking at that as well. But getting back to our mares and our strongos, during all of farm testing, it's a really easy time for us to capitalise on that technique, poop out the mare straight in the Ziploc bag, express the air in the fridge, off we trot. Really easy. And then the second time, of course, that we can maximise our involvement is during the breeding season. Everything's coming through the crush, and it just takes out that really high time cost for staff because we are there anyway and we're covered up to our armpits. So they're the two very, very important times. I guess it goes without saying, bear in mind that we are not doing fecal egg counts if the mare has had a recent dewormer. So we need to be a little bit cognizant of when those mares arrived on farm and or when they may last have been dewormed. For us though, 80% of our mares are being dewormed, I should say, once a year. Occasionally twice, depending on whether or not they are pregnant and how they're going through the system, but the vast majority are getting one a year.
So can you just give some, just outline a little bit of going from an interval dosing regime, which was in place a number of years ago now, to a targeted treatment of those high shedders and far less treatment of the others, and particularly in the adult population and the young stock we'll talk about as well. But can you just give some kind of indication as to what the economic impact has been in your setting, given that it is it's not a unique setting, but it's a particular setting that's going to be different in different circumstances. But what sort of an economic shift have you seen in relation to a change in management like that?
Yeah, I think one thing I'm going to say is a general comment that everyone obviously understands is using a dewormer, A, when you don't need to, and B, that's ineffective, is an absurd use of your funds. So regardless of what actually, what figures you can come up with on, we used to worm 6 or 8 times a year and now we're worming once, you can do that maths quite in a straightforward fashion. However, what you can't add into that equation is how much were you wasting in the first place, and I don't mean just financially, but what impact were you having on the environment, what impact were you having on resistance. There are other ecological challenges, things like dung beetles. I think we need to be a much more aware actually of what impact we're having on other coprophagous insects, etc. So yeah, when you talk about finances, it's a great question because I think there's a lot of it that's unquantifiable. But if we use the basis of the now outdated advice that we were giving a dewormer every 6 or 8 weeks, so that amounts to 8 to 6 or 6 to 8 wormers per year. Dewormers, I should say. I always say wormers, sorry, that's a bit of a bad habit.
Probably are wormers now.
Yeah, true that. So if we work off that as a direct example, and now we're saying that in the first year we're trying to ascertain whether they're high or low shedders, there is a cost involved there that is a little higher than if we were worming them 6 times a year. But that very quickly gets it flipped on its head because you start to see that the vast majority of your mares are low shedders. And so very quickly, you're not then having to deworm them. In the second year and subsequent years, it's very much financially beneficial because you are, as I said, the vast majority of the time only worming once, maybe twice for your 80% of your mares, and potentially 3 times for your high shedders. And again, the caveat being that's in our environment, in our climate. We have a fairly low stocking density. We do use a lot of other adjunctive techniques. We crossgraze with cows. We do, here you go, Tia, we do use biowormer. targetedly, but we use biowormer and very happy with it.
Lovely.
Yeah. We do actually restock our dung beetles as well periodically, because we have concerns around the fact that mectins are our main control at the moment for strongyles, and we know that the mectin and the dung beetle are not best friends. In fact, the dung beetle loves to actually, it's very attractive to the MLs. So we do that as also a bit of an adjunct treatment. But rotational grazing with cattle, spelling pastures, etc., is certainly, they're all techniques that we do use. Where did I get to, Catherine? Oh, the cost. Yeah, so once you get into year 2, beg your pardon, once you get into year 2, then you are well ahead financially, because you're not, 80% of those mares, you do not need to be quite so aggressive about your fecal egg counts in our environment. Can't talk to other people's environment, but that low shedding status is reasonably consistent for those mares. So we will periodically check them, but it's not 3 times a year, and it's quite often not even annually. Where we do continue to do the diagnostics is the high shedder.
Excellent. I'm very aware we are on 7 o'clock, but I'm happy to keep going for a little bit of this discussion, just because it's such a rich one and it's so fabulous to have you all in the same space. So to those who are listening on, if you want to leave, feel free to do so at any point. But I do just want to go on for a few more minutes, because I don't want to lose this knowledge. So Wen, could you just touch a little bit, you touched a little bit on the environmental impacts of anthelmintics and just what that's doing to, potentially doing to the dung beetle population. Can you just talk a little bit to refugia and the importance of that in a pasture situation, just the whole idea of what that is and why it's so important? And anyone else can pile on if you feel like it. Just
yeah, I'm happy for anyone to pipe up, but I think refugia is at least our best friend for the time being in Australia. So that's the population of parasites that are not exposed to a dewormer, and so therefore their resistance, their pressure to develop resistance is obviously in a completely different track to those that we are exposing to the dewormer. And that's where I think we haven't maybe touched on, but it is really good, I think pretty good science to show that until you get your deworming frequency down to 2 or less, you are not changing your resistance pressures. So it's a really important
annually.
Yeah. Yeah. So those high shedding mares, we will still try in a good season to only deworm twice a year, because we are obviously trying as best we can to reduce that resistance selection. So the refugia for us is really important. One of the questions I think I get asked is, when the mares come into quarantine and they have a fecal egg count performed straight away, and then if they're 0, great, we will at the end of quarantine put them out in the mob. And if they've got a fecal egg count of any note, we'll do a fecal egg count reduction just to see what's going on there. And then the question I get asked is, what do you do with those mares if their fecal egg count reduction test is not greater than 95%? Well, I challenge the whole group to tell me what you can do, because I don't see that we can keep them separate when we have such a broad emerging concern. And my thought process is that they need to go out there and be diluted by the refugia, given that we haven't got the vast majority of those mares under pressure for our dewormers.
I would agree.
Oh, great.
So,
thanks, Nikki.
Yeah. No bother. Yeah, so I actually did a decision tree for a client yesterday for a report I was giving to them, because actually what we're finding is some of our top studs, I definitely think this is probably happening for you too, Wendy, is they send off their homebreds to be trained. Some colts, some fillies, depends what they're bringing back. Most of the time they're bringing back fillies. It's kind of a rarity to be bringing back a stallion, really, isn't it? So they're bringing back their fillies, who then become broodmares. But having worked in the racing industry, both here and in Australia, there's a very high level of deworming in those animals, and they're often put out on rotating pastures. They go out for 2 hours and they're brought back in, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the time, I have a hypothesis that these fillies are coming back quite high resistant burdens, and then there are baby foals moms, obviously, so propagating that problem. But a lot of the time, because they're homebreds, people don't check them, right? Because they're their own, so they're just bringing them back and throwing them back out in the field. And so we started looking at that quite a lot, and we are finding that problem. And then the question is, so what do I do with them? And I completely agree with you. So actually, there's this whole thing that Eric Morgan talks about. He'd be a big guy in the parasite world, and particularly he's an epidemiologist who works in Queens, and he talks about cultivating the susceptible parasite population on your farm, and that almost could you have like a field that has susceptible parasite population. And like the idea just blows my mind, right? Because again, it's that paradigm shift. So like, could you have a field where, for instance, like let's say you have dry mares who are low shedders who haven't been wormed in 6 years, right? Those dry mares go into that field for the whole of their off season, right? So when you take them out of there, you know that their parasites have not been exposed. And so you get those new mares that have come in, that's where they go. And so now you're challenging the resistant worms because you're diluting them, but hopefully as well, when they are propagating within the animal, they're propagating with susceptible worms. I don't know how it works because no one's looked at it, but that idea that not only are you getting them to eat more susceptible worms, so you're hopefully having that competitive piece, but you're also having like almost a parasite breeding piece within the animal to dilute genetics. So Wendy, do we have any proof of this? Absolutely not. But application of first principles and, the desperate need to be able to put in something practical on a farm instead of just talking about it academically. That's my kind of new approach. Like one of my other farms have bought new land and I'm like, only put dry mares on that for the moment, or only put your, good the brood mares you talk of, Wendy, the ones that are getting one wormer a year or whatever. That's who's going out there. Because I've had other farms, really interestingly, and actually Sarah worked with me on this farm, where they put their colts out in this particular area, and within 4 years they had an outbreak of acute larval cell stominosis in their colts. It only took 4 years.
It's fascinating discussion. Go in, sorry.
I just was going to say to Nikki and Chris and Anne can certainly pipe in here, or Abdul for that matter. It's a curious observation. I'm not going to add anything particularly explanatory to this, but just a comment. It's a curious observation that in Australia, as a slight generalization, but and certainly in America, we see far fewer episodes of larval cythostomonosis. And maybe Chris or Anne or Nikki might like to comment on why that might be. Because I think it's fascinating.
I'm happy for the lads to talk to it. I can talk to the Irish situation then, Chris, when you're.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki, and I don't necessarily have the answers, Wendy, but I certainly would agree entirely with you in as much as we seldom see larval cythostomonosis in Australia. I have occasionally seen it, and I have occasionally seen large strongole associated disease, but certainly not with the frequency that in a previous lifetime when I worked at the University of Glasgow, we would certainly see it there. And I think that's more, and Tim, I think, is still on the chat. Tim would have seen his fair share of larval associated disease, and Nikki's published on it. So it's certainly interesting that we don't see it as much, whether that's due to different selection pressures, whether it's differences in the specific species, obviously recognizing there's over 50 species of cythostomes. I suspect not. The work that Abdul and Gaz did on the metagenomics wasn't as if we had wildly different cythostome species in Australia. Anne, did you have anything to comment on that?
No, well, I can't really, because I'm a parasitologist but not a vet. I can't really contribute to the clinical viewpoint of that. But that's certainly interesting what you're saying there, Chris, that we don't see as much. And I wonder also if stocking densities have anything to do with just the pressure that's maybe present in, maybe we have larger properties here. I'm not sure. That's a wild guess.
Yeah, I like you say, Tim's on the call, and Tim was the trailblazer in regards to osis kind of work. So I don't know, Tim, if you want to jump in there, and has just supervised April Lawson to bring out another kind of update on referral cases in regards to ALC. But like if we go back to the Parasite themselves, you know, like they don't like Australian summers at all, you know. They don't like them.
Not many people do.
Yeah, so like to be honest with you, Catherine, like I suffered myself. But as Jackie Matthews once said, you know, like Ireland's a parasite paradise, you know, all year round transmission, beautiful grass that they can crawl up. They don't even have like a hot midday sun that they get caught in, you know, they can hang on those water droplets at the top of the grass all day long. So I think from that standpoint, we certainly have year-round transmission, which of course is going to really exponentially increase the numbers in the horse themselves. And then we don't have the break to allow pastures to recoup. You know, like I said, even working in Australia, like, you know, unless the place is irrigated, you really don't have the green fields, and not every place would have that. And so I think from that point of view, yes. But interestingly, as you brought up, Wendy, ascarids, I felt anecdotally was something I did see in Australia, which we do see here too. But you know, the outside of an ascarid egg is so thick that, you know, its survival in those kind of harsh environments seems to be really, you know, resilient. And so yeah, I think it's that break, as Abdul just put into the group, it's that break. But actually, if you look at the evidence we have, we still don't have an amazing evidence on it. But certainly there's a really lovely paper on transmission by Ramsey from 2004 in the Scottish environment. And you can see there a really big difference. And there's another one from a Brazilian environment. And again, you can see a really big difference. So I do think you guys are blessed in that regard. But I think it's contributed to the rapid rate of resistance rise, because then people were worming and putting horses onto pasture where there was no worms. So now all that was being expelled onto that pasture was resistant worms. So I think from that point of view, you have to be very careful around rapid anthelmintic resistance propagation, because you actually don't have the refugia on the pasture. You're purely working on the refugia in the horse.
Excellent. Well, I think we've done an amazing job in an hour and 12 minutes to understand the landscape both in the northern and southern hemisphere. Nikki, I think your idea of a common site for resources is absolutely a fabulous imperative. I know that in Australia, in different species, there's Parabos, which is utilised for all sorts of other species, and there's a lot of ability to kind of put your own situation into that. Wendy, thank you so much for the shout out for FECRT. I think those sorts of resources just need to become more well known and mainstream in the way they're being used. I think we've done a pretty good job of covering off. Caitlin, is there anything else you'd like to say? I know we are looking from a sustainability lens, and there's the whole other sort of secondary effects of anthelmintic resistance, not just on the environment, but on the economic impact and on the whole supply chain and what that looks like. I did just want to mention the fact that, the glory of AI, we're now actually seeing fecal egg count machines developing, being trained on AI and making that job more standardized. And I think that's one of the issues too, having different people looking at fecal egg counts, having a standardized way of that to happen is going to be helpful as well. And I'm opening up for anyone else to give any other comments. Caitlin, if you'd like to wrap up.
I think in terms of the general sustainability angle, I mean, Wendy really covered it as well. If you are treating with dewormers and they're not working, well, you're wasting resources, you are wasting additional carbon footprint. It's a no-brainer. So no, I think it's been a really great discussion. There were a few points that came up in the chat. So if anyone doesn't have their chat open, to have a quick flick back through, I think most of them have been answered as we went. So thank you very much to everyone else in the audience about biowormer, where it is being used, how long it can last in feed for, and then also looking at the different cutoffs for low, moderate, and high shedders. Wendy, do you just use a low and high, or do you also use a moderate cutoff, or it doesn't really make much difference in terms of your clinical decisions for that animal?
Yeah, we do currently use high. What I will say though is that if our mares fall into the 350 to 500 fecal egg count, we watch them a little bit more closely to determine that is consistent. Those mares, I think I always flag as being potential just to shift a little bit within that category into high. And of course, we know that, we can get one fecal ball out of a fecal pat, and that doesn't represent what the egg shedding is. So, looking at the limitations of what a fecal egg count can tell you, I think we need to just be that little bit more careful about ascertaining what category they're in. So high shedders to me is still greater than 500, but when we're ascertaining their category, we look carefully in that 300, 350 zone.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, that's great. Does anybody from the panel have anything else that they'd just like to add? Go, Wendy.
I think we just, there's a few take homes, but one that I want to make sure, I've said a few, unfortunately, but fecal egg counts and egg numbers, just really remember that the way we interpret those is important. It is not about the disease status of the mare. It is not about the number of worms she's got in her abdomen at all. It is purely just looking at pasture contamination, and that does full cycle back to what Nikki was saying. It really is a pasture-based problem. And then the only other comment that I want to make is that we do need to keep our eyes and ears open for changes in advice. We are talking at the moment about what advice is coming out, and we no longer harrow, we no longer put our dewormed horses onto clean pasture, all the things that we learned when we came through the system. But that doesn't mean that what we're saying today is, set in concrete. I think we need to be much more open-minded.
I think that's the truth of it. It's a dynamic situation, and it's going to keep on emerging whichever way it goes. So I think that is it's incumbent on us all in decision-making positions to be influencing what those behaviours are as best we can, and putting the information out there. I know it's been a fantastic panel, and I thank you all so much for giving so willingly of your time. I know that there'll probably be other questions that might come up for people. Caitlin, I'm sure you'll be happy for them to contact.
Feel free to email me, absolutely. Everyone will get an email tomorrow with the link to the recording of this. It is open access. It will be on our website and on YouTube, so I'm sure it will also be something that gets forwarded around. But yes, if any emails come through, I'll send them through to different panel members, and we'll try and get some follow-up.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you all very, very much. It's now 7:18, and I think probably some of us need to go and have some dinner. Some of us need to go and have a little cup of tea. And we thank you all for your attention, everyone, and thank you so much for such interest in this important area.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.